Patricia Langford strolled through Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, her high heels clicking softly but firmly. Her designer followed quietly behind her, a familiar sight from countless trips before. Everything about air travel had a ritual to her: priority boarding, complimentary champagne, hushed conversations between businessmen and politicians, a world she belonged to. First class wasn't just an option, it was a given. So when she approached her row and saw a black man sitting there, dressed in a crisp navy blue suit, eyes glued to his laptop screen as if he were examining an important document, she paused. A slight disruption to her familiar world. She didn't let it show, merely pursing her lips, gently setting her tote bag down, a little more forcefully than necessary, before settling into her seat. She tried not to stare, but discomfort crept in. The feeling that something was wrong, that there had been a mistake. First class wasn't supposed to be like this. She adjusted her skirt, shifting slightly in her seat, but the man didn't seem to notice. His hands flew over the keyboard, the light from the screen reflecting off his dark skin, highlighting the sharp lines of his face. There was something too confident about his composure. Like he belonged here. But he didn't belong here. It couldn't be. She accidentally brushed her purse against his armrest. No response. She waited for an apologetic look, a gesture to make room. But there was none. It only added to her unease. She sat up straight, glanced around, as if expecting a flight attendant to notice the anomaly. No one did. She cleared her throat, deciding to handle this her way. Leaning slightly toward him, just enough so that her presence couldn't be ignored, she spoke, her voice careful to maintain the necessary politeness. "Excuse me. Are you sure you're in the right seat?" The man finally raised his head. His eyes were calm, without any hint of confusion or bewilderment. A faint smile flickered. "Yes, right there." No explanation. No justification. Just a firm statement. Patricia was taken aback. She had expected some hesitation, some respectful response, perhaps an apology if this had been a mistake. Instead, he remained calm, returning to his work as if she had no longer existed. She felt a tinge of unease run down her spine. Maybe with just a little more, a few carefully chosen words, she could make him uncomfortable. Enough to make him realize this wasn't the place for him. But then, before she could say anything else, he slowly reached into his coat pocket. A moment of tension flashed through her mind. And then he pulled out a card, flipping it over in front of her. The cabin lights reflected off the gleaming FBI badge. "Agent Daniel Stokes," he said, his voice calm. "Nice to meet you." The air seemed to freeze. Patricia said nothing, but she sensed one thing clearly: this time, she had screwed up. Emily Jacobs, a young woman in her early 30s, walked down the aisle of the business-class cabin with her usual professional demeanor. She was used to situations like this: unhappy passengers, petty complaints, misunderstandings that were sometimes insignificant. But today, something was different. She paused as Patricia gently raised her hand, signaling her. But before she could react, a look caught her eye, from a male flight attendant, who was standing near the door with a knowing, observant gaze. A smile played at the corner of his lips, but enough for Emily to notice. A look that didn't leave in a hurry, as if he cared about her, or more. Emily quickly pulled herself back to the present and approached Patricia with her usual professional smile. "Is everything okay, ma'am?" she asked, her tone soft but clear. Patricia tried to chuckle, shaking her head as if she found the situation funny. "I think there's been a bit of a mistake. I believe this gentleman is in the wrong seat." Emily glanced at Daniel, who had finally stopped typing and looked up. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in his eyes, not surprise, not confusion, but something deeper. Emily quickly pulled the passenger list from her tablet, scanning the assigned seats. "Actually, Mr. Stokes is in his correct seat," she said politely. "His ticket says 2A, and he's in 2B." Patricia blinked, her fingers tightening around the edge of the armrest. "That's odd," she said, trying to hold back her smile. "Are you sure?" Emily held her gaze. "I am sure, ma'am. Everything looks right." Patricia's face twitched, her expression wavering for a split second before she smoothed it over with a tight-lipped smile. "Well, I suppose mistakes happen." She turned back to the window, but Emily could sense it, she wasn't done. Not yet. As Emily turned away, she glanced involuntarily at the male flight attendant. He was still standing there, watching her with a quiet concern, a gaze that wasn't exactly curious but more personal. A little challenging, a little interested. Emily felt her heartbeat change, but she kept her composure, continuing to move toward the back of the cabin. She knew, though, the gaze wasn't over, and maybe, this was just the beginning. He still didn't play the game. She had expected him to react in some way, a raised eyebrow, a sly comment, even a slight smirk. But no. He remained where he was, completely ignoring her presence. Which made her even angrier. Patricia wasn't the type to let things slide. She never had been, and she certainly wasn't going to change just because of this situation. She didn't suffer in silence. She had never suffered in silence. She decided to act. Patricia sat up straight, stiff, her arms crossed over her chest. She felt her chest rise and fall faster, her lips pressed into a straight line. Her mind was racing, and each thought fed into the simmering dissatisfaction inside her. This wasn't right. This wasn't how things worked for her. She had flown first class for decades. She was used to comfort, to certain standards. And never, never, had she been in a situation like this, trapped next to someone like him. The man beside her had done nothing wrong. But that didn't matter. He didn't belong here. Didn't belong in the air she was breathing. She felt her breathing quicken, her palms beginning to tighten on her arms. Her anger was boiling, waiting for an excuse to explode. She couldn't just sit here and accept this. She pressed the call button. A soft chime sounded overhead, and a few minutes later, Emily Jacobs appeared. Her smile was once again the perfect mask of professionalism, warm, attentive, calm. "Is there anything I can help you with?" Patricia kept her voice soft, but each word was carefully considered. "I'd like to request a seat change." Emily blinked. "Oh. Are you uncomfortable? Is there a problem with the chair?" Patricia hesitated for a split second. She couldn't bring herself to say what she really thought. Instead, she tilted her head toward Daniel, lowering her voice even further. "I just don't feel comfortable sitting here." She spoke slowly and deliberately, each word enunciated with absolute control. Emily's smile faltered. "I'm sorry to hear that, ma'am. If there's a technical problem with the chair, I'd be more than happy to." "No," Patricia interrupted. "That's not the seat." She took a deep breath, trying to keep her composure. "I just want to sit somewhere else." Emily glanced at Daniel, who had stopped typing again but still said nothing. He was listening. Waiting. His fingers hovered over the keyboard, his jaw clenched. "Let me see if there's an empty seat," Emily said, tapping away at her tablet. Patricia sat back, her lips pressed together, her gaze fixed straight ahead. Daniel didn't respond. He didn't argue. He just waited, as if it were none of his business. And that, more than anything, annoyed her the most. A few rows ahead, a man in a trench coat turned his head slightly, pretending to check his phone but clearly listening. Across the aisle, a woman nudged her husband. Everyone had noticed. Emily's fingers moved quickly across the screen. "I'm afraid we're overbooked today, ma'am. There are no first-class seats available." Patricia didn't respond immediately. A dull ache rolled in her stomach. Emily kept her professional smile, tilting her head in anticipation. "Do you want me to check you in economy? There might be a seat there." Hot. She felt hot all over. Her face was flushed, and for a moment, she couldn't breathe. But no. She couldn't let this happen now. Not here. Not in front of all of them. Her voice was dry as she spoke. That won't work. Emily's smile didn't waver. In that case, I hope you don't mind sitting in your assigned seat. Patricia forced a small smile to her lips. I suppose I have no choice. Emily nodded. Let me know if you need anything else. Then she walked away. Patricia barely noticed. Her ears were ringing. Daniel remained silent, eyes glued to the computer screen, fingers hovering over the keyboard. Not a glance, not a word. That was his answer. Her fingers clenched into fists. She swallowed her anger, took a deep breath. This wasn't over. She pressed the call button again. This time, Emily hesitated before turning back. Ma'am. Patricia sat up straight. I need to speak to the person in charge. Emily's face remained neutral. I'm the lead flight attendant on this flight. Is there anything I can clarify for you? Patricia's voice sharpened. I need to speak to the chief flight attendant. Or the pilot. A murmur rippled through the cabin. Someone let out a soft chuckle. Emily's expression didn't change, but her patience was clearly wearing thin. Ma'am, the pilot is preparing for takeoff and won't be available. But I'd be happy to assist you. Patricia pursed her lips, her jaw clenched. She glanced quickly at Daniel. No reaction. No fidgeting, no sign of discomfort. It was as if she didn't exist. She lowered her voice again. I don't feel safe now that things have changed. Emily's smile faded. Her body stiffened. Daniel stopped typing. He had heard that before, from this woman. But they hadn't been here, not in this situation. The words echoed with a distant memory, a chilling sense of repetition. Across the aisle, a middle-aged man wearing a Bluetooth headset muttered something unintelligible. Here we go again. Emily straightened, her eyes flicking to Daniel. There was no comfort in her posture. This was a strange feeling, she had experienced it before. I'm sorry, ma'am, a voice said, sharp but not loud. But could you clarify what you mean? Patricia folded her arms neatly in her lap, tilting her head slightly. A small gesture but meaningful. I just don't feel comfortable. Me. She hesitated long enough to hint at something, not to say it outright. I don't want to be difficult, but I think it would be better if someone else had taken this seat. Daniel closed his laptop. This time, he looked her straight in the eye. And for the first time, Patricia felt a flicker of unease. But she didn't let it go easily. And now, she was getting louder. A silence fell over the cabin. The weight of Patricia's words hung in the air. I don't feel safe when. The phrase was powerful. It wasn't loud, but it didn't need to be loud. It was carefully chosen, designed to trigger a response. Emily remained standing next to her, not moving immediately. Her posture was stiff, her eyes on Daniel, who had closed his laptop completely, his hand resting on top of it. He didn't smile. He didn't frown. He just stared at Patricia. Studying. Patricia didn't waver either. Not yet. Emily exhaled slowly. Her mother spoke carefully. Are you saying you felt threatened? Patricia tilted her head a little, the tiniest shrug. I didn't say that. I just felt uncomfortable, that's all. Across the aisle, the businessman with the Bluetooth scoffed, muttering. Unbelievable. A young woman sitting 3 rows away picked up her phone a little, pretending to text but clearly recording. A few other passengers whispered to each other. Daniel stared at Patricia for a beat longer. Then he slowly opened his laptop again, but this time, his fingers weren't typing. Patricia sensed a change taking place around her. Like a turning tide, she could feel the atmosphere turning against her. But she had no intention of backing down. She was used to being in control of situations, and this was no exception. Trying to keep her tone calm, Patricia pretended to be polite, but there was a hint of sharpness in her words. "I'm just asking for help. If I'm uncomfortable, I should have the right to change seats." Emily, the flight attendant, kept her face professional, but her eyes couldn't hide her hesitation. "Ma'am, I've checked, and there are no empty first-class seats." Patricia pursed her lips. She didn't like being turned down. "What about empty seats in economy?" Emily hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "There are 2 empty seats there." Patricia straightened her back, holding her head high. "He can take one of them." A small murmur spread through the cabin. Eyes began to turn to them. Daniel, the man sitting next to Patricia, took a deep breath. His fingers tapped once on the surface of his laptop before setting his hands down. He didn't argue, didn't retort. But he didn't move either. Emily blinked, seemingly replaying Patricia's words in her head to make sure she hadn't misheard. Her voice was low, firmer. "Just to be clear, you want me to move this passenger to economy because you don't want to sit next to him?" Patricia nodded, more firmly this time. She sat up straight, her eyes shining with anticipation that her request would be granted. Emily inhaled through her nose, a slow, deliberate breath. "That's not going to happen." Patricia's eyes widened, not believing her ears. "Excuse me." Emily crossed her arms over her chest, her voice unwavering. "Mr. Stokes has a first-class ticket, just like you. He is sitting in his assigned seat. I cannot and will not ask him to move." Patricia's face was red. She felt like she was losing control of the situation, and it made her seethe. The passengers around her were staring, some whispering, some shaking their heads. One young woman was still holding her phone, recording the whole thing. Patricia's stomach clenched. She could feel the heat rising in her chest. "This is ridiculous," she hissed. "I'm asking for the same courtesy I would give anyone else. I have a right to be comfortable on this flight." Emily didn't budge. "You're asking me to force a fully paid passenger out of his seat and downgrade to economy without any good reason. That's not a reasonable arrangement." The words were like a knife to Patricia's pride. She felt like she was being put on the back foot, something she was not used to. Frustration, shame, and anger mixed together. But for the first time during the confrontation, she didn't know how to respond. Someone blew a low whistle. Daniel didn't move, didn't say a word. He just looked at Patricia, waiting. Patricia's pulse pounded in her ears. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. Emily straightened her shoulders. "Ma'am, we're about to take a taxi." Her voice was calm but sharp. Eyes began to turn toward Patricia. Some were quick glances, some stared longer than necessary. Patricia felt them piercing her like tiny knives. "If you can't sit still and follow the crew's instructions, I'll have to ask you to leave the plane." Patricia's stomach clenched. Emily's words, though spoken professionally, carried an unmistakable heaviness. Choices. Stay where you are. Or be pushed off the plane under scrutiny. But Patricia was not to blame. She opened her mouth, ready to protest. But before she could speak, Daniel reached into his pocket. He pulled out a leather case, flipped it open, and held it up. Everything changed. The gold FBI badge glinted in the cabin lights. The air on the plane was strangely still. Patricia's entire body stiffened. A few passengers took a deep breath. Some chuckled, not in amusement, but in shock. The young woman recording zoomed in immediately. Daniel's voice was so calm it was almost unreadable. He tilted his head. "Ma'am, would you like to file a formal complaint? I can take your statement right now." Patricia's breath caught. The words of protest were caught in her throat. Daniel didn't move. He didn't blink. He just waited. And for the first time, Patricia felt truly trapped. But not just embarrassed. This time, she was about to face real consequences. The silence in the cabin was heavy. No one clapped, no one giggled anymore. The passengers who had been whispering a few minutes ago now stared. Some with cold amusement, some with obvious discomfort. Daniel's badge still gleamed. A symbol that no one could ignore. A silence so sharp it could cut through the air. Patricia felt as if the air around her had suddenly become thick, heavy, pressing against her chest. All eyes were on her, wide, surprise, curiosity, or even contempt. Her throat was dry, as if every drop of water had been drained from her body. Her brain was racing, trying to find an explanation, an excuse, a way out. But there was nothing but emptiness and despair. This was not supposed to happen. The man she had tried to drag off the plane, the man she had implied was a threat, was now sitting in front of her with a shiny badge in his hand. Daniel remained eerily calm, no smile, no smirk. He just sat there, eyes locked on her, waiting. His voice was flat, emotionless. "Do you wish to file a formal complaint, ma'am?" The words hung in the air like a loaded bullet, ready to tear her world apart. Patricia felt her body freeze, heat spreading to her neck and face. She tried to speak, but only a weak, choked sound escaped. Daniel tilted his head, his eyes unwavering. "You said you felt uncomfortable," he continued, his tone polite but sharp as a knife. "It's a serious charge on a federal flight. If you believe I did something inappropriate, I'd be happy to take your statement." Patricia's stomach tightened as if she'd fallen into a bottomless pit. She could feel it, the shift. Just minutes ago, she'd been in control. She'd expected sympathy, expected someone to take her side. But now, she was the one being watched. A soft chuckle came from the front row. "Oh, this is priceless," a man whispered, shaking his head, a mocking smile playing on his lips. The young woman holding the phone was zooming in on Patricia's face. Everything was being recorded. Everything. Emily, the flight attendant, stood nearby, her arms crossed over her chest. Her face was perfectly neutral, but her eyes were not. There was a quiet understanding in them, an expectation. She was waiting. Everyone was waiting. Patricia's breathing was coming in short gasps, her chest rising and falling with each shallow breath. She couldn't admit that she had lied. She couldn't say that it was all an act she'd put up to get away from him. But if she continued, if she stuck to her accusation, it would mean she was exposing a federal agent as a flight hazard, and the consequences would be unimaginable. Her hands shook in her lap. Daniel still hadn't looked away. Patricia shook her head weakly, not moving. She was hoarse, not complaining. Daniel nodded once, as if he had expected it. He slowly closed his badge, tucked it back into his jacket, and opened his laptop again. And that was it. For him, at least. For Patricia, the nightmare was just beginning. A few passengers murmured their approval. A couple even applauded. The businessman across the aisle smiled and returned to his newspaper. The young woman with the phone, she was already typing. Patricia could feel her heart pounding. She wanted to melt into her seat, disappear, go back in time and undo the last 10 minutes. But there was no way to undo this. She had embarrassed herself in public. She had been exposed, and worse, everyone had seen it and recorded it. Her eyes darted around the cabin, searching for an ally, someone who could offer a sympathetic look. No one did. Even Emily, the only one who had been patient with her, lost the warmth in her expression. Patricia swallowed. She wanted to argue, to say something to regain control, but deep down, she knew there was nothing left to say. The flight hadn't even taken off, and somehow she was lost. But Patricia wasn't just embarrassed. She was about to face real consequences. She sat rigidly in her seat, staring straight ahead. Her breathing was shallow, her face hot. This wasn't just embarrassment. This was humiliation. Daniel had moved on. He had turned his laptop upside down, opened it again, his fingers tapping lightly on the keyboard, as if she didn't exist. The rest of the cabin, however, had not forgotten. Across the aisle, the businessman with the Bluetooth smiled to himself. The recording woman had stopped typing, but her phone was still tilted slightly upward, as if waiting for Patricia to respond. Even the flight attendant, though trying to remain neutral, had a look of confusion in her eyes. And then, a moment that seemed to last a century. Patricia felt the air around her thicken, as if the entire cabin were pressing down on her. She tried to suppress a shaky breath, but her throat tightened. The warmth of humiliation spread from her chest to her fingertips. Her eyes were watering, not from tears, but from the fact that her mind could no longer process all that was happening. She wasn't just left behind. She was left alone. Patricia took a deep breath, trying to stay calm, but the silence around her was heavier than ever. The people she had thought neutral, the quiet passengers, the flight attendants standing nearby, now seemed more than mere bystanders. They were listening, observing, and, perhaps, judging. Emily kept her face professional, but something had changed in her eyes. It was no longer the polite patience Patricia had noticed earlier, instead, an assessment, a distance that had not been there before. She was no longer just a flight attendant. She was a gatekeeper, a decision maker. And she had made a decision. "Ma'am," Emily repeated, her voice low but loud enough to block any escape routes. "I need to confirm that you are okay to continue the flight without any further disruption." Patricia felt every eye on her. People who had been mere shadows in her vision were now silent witnesses. Some glanced at her, then quickly looked away, as if not wanting to get involved. Others, like the bespectacled man 2 rows away, made no secret of their curiosity. Their neutrality was now a thin mask, and Patricia could sense the judgment behind it. She forced herself to smile, a thin, strained smile. "I'm fine," she said, her voice dry. Emily paused for a moment, as if weighing whether to believe her. Then she nodded, not quite in acceptance, but as if remembering it. "I'll hold you to that," she said, and turned to walk away. Patricia let out a breath, her hands clasped in her lap. She thought it was over. But then a sharp sound broke the silence, the chime of a text message. She looked up, startled. The young woman sitting nearby picked up her phone, smiling as she looked at the screen. She tapped twice, her eyes flashing with amusement. Patricia's stomach clenched. She knew that look. She'd seen it on her grandchildren's faces when they shared something online, something they knew would go viral. She spun around, her heart pounding. Her eyes flicked to the young woman's screen. And then, she saw it. The video was uploaded. The air was knocked from her chest. The neutrals, the silent observers, were now witnesses. There was no neutrality anymore. It was just her and a world ready to judge. The flight had not yet taken off. Patricia felt the unsteady beat of her chest as her eyes drifted to the man sitting just a few feet away. It was him again, in his neat suit, his gaze so calm it made her uneasy. She had spoken up, had asked the flight attendant to do something, because he did not belong in first class, because she was uncomfortable. But then, when the FBI badge appeared, the air in the cabin seemed to freeze. Her hands turned cold. She tried to take a deep breath, but the air stuck in her throat. A strange feeling crept into her chest, not shame, exactly, but fear. A primal, panicky fear, as if she had crossed a line from which no one could pull her back. And then, somehow, she was gone. The phone in her purse vibrated for the first time. The second time. The third time. She didn't want to look. She didn't want to know. But her fingers automatically slipped into her pocket, gripping the device. She pulled it out, and a chill ran down her spine as she saw a series of messages. From friends. From family. From people she hadn't heard from in months. Each message was a variation of the same question. Patricia, is it real? Oh my God, what did you just do? Her heart pounded in her ears. She opened the browser with shaking hands, typing in Twitter. It took less than a second. Her name was already trending. The video had been posted less than 5 minutes ago. The views had already passed 20,000 and were climbing. And the comments. Karma is real. She thinks she can get away with this. Hope she likes the ridicule she's about to get. Patricia's vision blurred. Her chest tightened so much she couldn't breathe properly. She read the comments, each word a knife cutting into her reality. Her world wasn't just falling apart. It was burning. And for the first time in her life, she realized there was no coming back from this. But the scariest thing wasn't what was happening in the cabin. It was what would happen when the flight landed. 30,000 views. 42,000, 61,000. It didn't slow down. Patricia blinked faster, her breath coming in gasps as she stared at the ever-increasing number. Her mind raced, trying to find a way out of this nightmare, a way to stop it before it was too late. But it was too late. Her fingers trembled as she swiped down the screen, a flood of comments jumping before her eyes. Imagine this guy. LM. She really thinks she's going to get away with it. The FBI part made my day. Instant karma. We need to know who she is. Her chest tightened. Everything felt tight around her ribcage, making it hard to breathe. She glanced around the cabin, her heart pounding in her chest as if searching for a way out. But no one looked at her. They didn't need to. They'd seen enough. She shifted in her seat, her entire body stiff. It felt like her body no longer belonged to her, trapped in a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. Beside her, Daniel remained silent. His fingers tapped lightly on the keyboard of his laptop, betraying no emotion. If he knew about the video, he said nothing. He didn't care. And that, somehow, made it worse. Patricia's phone vibrated. She looked down, startled. Her sister. She hesitated, her breath hitching, then pressed the call with shaking fingers. She couldn't talk right now. She wasn't ready. She wasn't ready for any of this. The plane hadn't even taken off yet, but her world was already starting to fall apart. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to calm down. She needed a plan. A way to fix this. Excuse me. Maybe that would help. But no, that only fanned the flames. Ignore it. Pretend she never saw the video. No. Worse. Her mind raced, thoughts colliding, spiraling into an invisible storm she couldn't control. And then, the pilot's voice came over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we are beginning our descent into Washington. Local time in D.C. is 5:43 p.m. Please ensure your seatbelts are fastened as we prepare to land. Patricia's heart dropped with the plane. She had been so focused on the chaos in the cabin that she had forgotten what awaited her on the other side of the runway. The screen of her phone lit up in the darkness, reflecting her frightened face. She refreshed the video one last time. Her name was everywhere. Her hands shook as she shoved the phone back into her pocket. Patricia tried to convince herself that she could get through this. Maybe. But maybe not. She swiped her finger across the screen, staring at the rising number. 1.5 million views. Her pulse quickened as she read the comments dancing across the screen. Who does she think she is? This is unacceptable behavior. Fire her immediately. Patricia's throat tightened. She swallowed, but the bitter taste remained. She shoved the phone back into her pocket, took a deep breath, and tried to quell the rising panic. When the plane touched down, she almost threw herself out of her seat as soon as the seatbelt sign turned off. She ignored the passing glances, the giggles, the gossip she didn't need to hear to imagine. She just got out. Right now. But as she entered Reagan National Airport, her heart stopped. A group of reporters stood near the baggage claim area, cameras trained on her. A woman in a navy blazer clutched a microphone, reading something from her phone. When the cameraman raised the camera, she spoke clearly. A viral video shows an unidentified woman trying to force an FBI agent out of first class for controversial reasons. The clip has been viewed over 2 million times in the last 6 hours. Patricia took a sharp breath. 2 million. No way. She turned away, hoping to escape before they noticed her. But it was too late. A reporter caught her eye. Her eyes lit up like a predator who had just found its prey. Wait, it's her. Patricia tightened her grip on her bag, turned and ran. Her breathing was ragged. Her heels clicked against the tile floor, echoing in the vast space. She had to get out of here, now. The phone in her pocket vibrated violently. Texts, missed calls, alerts. A wave of fury washed over her. There was no running away. There was no pretending this wasn't happening. She pushed past a group of tourists, almost colliding with a luggage cart. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. She was almost to the exit. Just a few more steps. Ms. Langford. The voice behind her rang out, louder than the airport noise. Do you have any feedback on the video? Patricia froze. She closed her eyes, her lips trembling. She hadn't even prepared herself for this moment. But it was here, and there was no turning back. A taxi slowed to the curb. The streetlights reflected off the windows, streaking them in a blur. Patricia nearly threw herself into the back seat, her breathing quickening. Now, she shouted at the driver. The man raised his eyebrows, hesitated, but then pulled away from the curb without a word. The low roar of the engine blended into the din of the city. She pressed her hands to her temples, her eyes closed. A million views. Her stomach clenched as if an invisible hand were squeezing it. She had spent her life building up a flawless image, step by step, paying attention to every detail. And now, it was all falling apart in a single afternoon. Her phone rang. Another call. An unknown number. She stared at the screen, her heart pounding. Part of her wanted to throw the phone out the window, cut herself off from the harsh reality. But just before the call went to voicemail, she swallowed her fear and swiped to answer. Hello. There was a pause. Then a deep, broken voice spoke. Miss Langford, this is James Rollins, president of the Marston Foundation. I assume you know the situation. Patricia's mouth went dry. She closed her eyes, trying to keep her voice from shaking. She had been involved with the Marston Foundation for years. A charity that was supposed to be progressive, inclusive, and ethical. But she knew this call wasn't sympathy. No one in the world would give her a chance to explain. James. We're going to need your resignation. He cut her off, his tone leaving no room for argument. Patricia stared straight ahead. It wasn't a request. It was an order. She could hear her heart pounding in her ears. But, the board needs to. The board has decided. His voice was flat, emotionless. We will make a public statement tomorrow morning. We expect your resignation before then. The cold beep sounded. He hung up. Patricia slowly lowered the phone. A hollow feeling spread through her chest. It was over. Her career, her reputation, all gone as if they had never existed. And the worst part? No one cared about the truth. No one waited for her to speak. They had seen the video. And the video was enough. She took a shaky breath, her hands clenching white. She had no control over anything. Not the public. Not the story. Not her own life. She had gotten herself into this situation. And now, she had to learn to live with it. Meanwhile, Daniel Stokes, the man who threw her into this nightmare, was probably in a meeting, completely unconcerned. To him, it was just a regular Tuesday. If this story got you thinking, don't forget to subscribe for more fascinating real-life stories.